By the fourth night, he stopped being afraid of dying. He was afraid something else was out there. Every few hours, the silence around his shelter would break. A branch would snap, then another. Sometimes he heard slow footsteps moving through the snow, stopping just beyond the edge of his firelight. He never saw what made them, but on the fifth morning, he found something in the snow outside his shelter. 3 deep tracks. They came toward him, then stopped, and beside them was a second set of footprints, his own, except he hadn't made them. The story is set in a fictional stretch of remote Alaskan wilderness, hundreds of miles from the nearest major town. A man named Daniel Carter had traveled there alone in late September, hoping to spend several days hunting and photographing the changing landscape before winter arrived. He carried a rifle, a small tent, limited food, matches, and a satellite communicator. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. Then a sudden storm moved across the mountains. Visibility disappeared within minutes. Daniel tried to retrace his route, but the landmarks he remembered were gone beneath fresh snow. He walked for hours, convinced he would eventually recognize something. Instead, darkness arrived, and somewhere behind him he heard a branch break, then another. Daniel built a small emergency shelter beneath a group of trees and started a fire. He rationed his food immediately. The satellite communicator showed a weak signal, but his attempts to send a distress message failed. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset. By morning, the storm had buried his tracks. That was when Daniel realized the real problem wasn't the cold. It was distance. He had no reliable idea where he was. He began walking south, using the position of the sun whenever the clouds opened. Several hours later, he reached a frozen creek and followed it downhill. Then the ice broke beneath him. One leg plunged into freezing water. Daniel pulled himself out, but his boot was soaked and his ankle was badly bruised. He could no longer walk normally, and the nearest road might have been many miles away. That night, Daniel heard the footsteps again, slow, heavy, moving around the shelter. He grabbed his rifle and sat beside the fire without making a sound. The footsteps stopped. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then came a low scraping noise against the trees behind him. Daniel aimed toward the darkness. Nothing. He stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, he discovered fresh tracks circling his shelter. They weren't clear enough to identify with certainty. They could have belonged to a large animal. But Daniel noticed something that frightened him more. The tracks approached his food bag. The bag had been dragged several feet away. From that moment on, he stopped thinking about getting home. His only goal was to make it through another night. He burned more wood, ate less, and kept his rifle within reach. By the 6th day, Daniel was exhausted. His ankle had swollen badly. His food was almost gone, and the cold had begun affecting his hands. He made one desperate decision. He left the shelter. Using a crude walking stick, he followed the creek downhill, hoping it would eventually lead toward a road or settlement. For hours, he moved slowly. Then he saw smoke. At first, he thought it was another fire. He almost cried from relief. But when he reached the ridge, there was nothing there. No camp, no cabin, only a thin column of mist rising through the trees. Daniel continued anyway. Near sunset, he heard an aircraft. He dropped his walking stick and fired 3 shots into the air. The plane passed overhead, then turned. For the first time in nearly a week, Daniel knew someone might have seen him. The aircraft belonged to a search team that had been looking for him after his failed communication attempts were partially received. A rescue crew reached Daniel the following morning. He was dehydrated, injured, and suffering from severe cold exposure, but he was alive. Investigators later examined the area around his abandoned shelter. They found animal tracks and evidence that something had dragged his food bag, but they could never determine exactly what had been moving around Daniel's shelter during those nights. There was no confirmed evidence of another person, no mysterious camp, no second survivor, and the strange tracks were never conclusively identified. Daniel eventually made it home, but according to the fictional account, he never returned to that part of Alaska. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing about the wilderness isn't knowing what is hunting you. It's knowing you'll never find out.